My doctor took one look at my baby's head sitting like this and said I need to go to a physical therapist to fix it. On this One Belly Wednesday, what I'm going to talk to you about is whether or not that's a good recommendation and how you know. I have seen so many babies with what they call torticollis. It's where a baby has a hard time twisting his or her head to the side or keeping it straight. You try to straighten it out and it keeps on tipping back to the side. There's some usual things that will come along with that. Usually there's some latching issues. And sometimes if you look and you're really picky about the baby, you'll see that there's a little bit of a change in how the baby's eyes sit. We call it like a pirate eye, like this. Or maybe you can even look at their ears and one sticking out, one got one flapper, one cap door open more on one side than the other. Those babies, when we have them come into our office, I go through a couple really simple basic things to help me understand whether what's going on here is a musculoskeletal, meaning like a muscle got hurt during the birth kind of problem, or if this is neurological. The neurological ones are definitely in the chiropractic wheelhouse, and I want to explain why. So when a baby gets through the birth canal, there's usually one of two things that happens. Either you have a birth provider who goes hands off, or you have a birth provider who goes hands on. And there's a reason why most torticollises tend to go to one direction. And that reason has a lot to do with handedness of obstetricians. So generally when they're doing this maneuver, they call it the sandwich maneuver, which basically puts your head as the head as the meat in the sandwich if you're the baby, and the birth provider's hands on the top and the bottom like this. So like this, they use that as a lever. They'll use the head as a lever to get the shoulders out, especially if you got a sticky one, something called shoulder dystocia. This is usually where the injury will happen. And so that injury involves a twisting or a tearing of possibly a sprain of a big muscle. It's a strappy muscle that goes from the back of the head down in the collarbone. It's called the sternocleidomastoideus, or SCM is how we're going to refer to it. It could also involve another big muscle. These muscles here, these are your trapezius muscles or your traps. And so sometimes they can get injured as well. Sometimes during that twist or the pull, there's actually a tearing that happens of the nerve bundle. They call it the brachial plexus. And so that baby will have a bit of a noodle arm. Sometimes that can get pinched immediately as the nerves exit the spine, but most commonly in the tough cases we've seen, there's an actual severing of the plexus further out into the shoulder. And so that led to all kinds of long-term problems. So here's the big question. Is that the injury you're looking at? Or did something else happen? So the something else that we look at has a lot to do with something that we call the frontal lobes. And the frontal lobes here for your baby are generally not super active until they're around 12 months old. So our frontal lobes do two things for us that I care about as a chiropractor. Number one, those frontal lobes help the brain switch on the ability to be upright. So you want your baby from being a little horizontal being to a vertical being by 12 months. The ability to resist gravity, to have core strength and stability, to stand, all have a lot to do with the frontal lobe's ability to calm down that fetal position, that cute little bit like baby bundle position that we see them in. It calms down those flexors there in their arms and their legs and their torso, and it helps to fire up the extensors to keep them nice and upright. The second thing that we'll also look for is that the neurological condition we would associate with fight or flight. Babies aren't going to run from something, they're going to fight something. They still have that ability inside their bodies to send a lot of tone out into their arms and their legs, away from their organs. And if that is the dominant system in a case of emergency, right, then that's a good thing. But for babies, our frontal lobes, not super well developed. So the automatic thing that we get coming out of the birth canal is that big breath of life that we call it the Morrow startle reflex, where baby tips the head back and the arms come up. That Morrow startle is there to expel the amniotic fluid out of the lungs, get us our first breath, and then we can carry on, right? At some point in time, the startle responses are still very useful. Hey, listen, I'm hungry. Hey, listen, I've got a blanket in my airway. Hey, listen, the dog's trying to eat my foot, right? All those things are really important for a baby to be able to yell and scream and ramp it up from 0 to 100 in order to survive. So our frontal lobes eventually, very gradually, start to tamp that down, which is why babies tend to kind of calm down later on. They can be really reactive at first. Sometimes, though, your baby's super sleepy. And this is usually the baby that I'll see with the twisting or the turning of the head. That baby was a little angel for the first couple of weeks. And the reason for that is because that baby landed in the 40%. So this is almost all, like half of all babies. The 40% of all babies who ended up with some kind of form of a bruise, something they call a subdural hematoma. And it was right underneath there, under the dura, under the protective wrapper between the skull and the brain. And under that wrapper in there, we got a little bit of a bruise that's changing how the nerve system functions. When that happens, especially just on the one side, then what we'll see is one-sided flexor tone increase. So flexors include that SCM muscle and that trap. So we'll see them tip over to one side. And we'll also see a little increase in that sympathetic tone. So when we tip the baby back, what we see is a little, really big, like big Marl response. Real loud startles to things like sounds or lights. We'll see that baby go 0 to 100, and it's like, wow, you're really hard to soothe. What we'll see is kind of that cry that goes, like gasping for air, because the diaphragm is not fully able to tend to open and really draw in a good breath. We'll see those babies have like super fast bowels. I'll ask how many times a day do the babies poop, and they're like, man, it's like every diaper. That's not a good sign. We'll also see some of those babies completely constipated, completely backed up because their digestive system's been completely shunted away from. We'll see them spit up a lot, have a really hard time with digesting food. So they may have a lot of that post-digested reflux. Again, because of the twisting that's been happening in their neck, they'll also take in a lot of air. They may have some issues in there with their jaw and that twisting of the cranium, that facial cranium. And so they're sucking air in, or they got such a twist in there that their nose is plugged. And it's like they're breathing through like trying to breathe through a straw with their nose plugged. And so they're sucking air in through the sides, cracking mom's nipples, creating a lot of air gaps and bubbles and blisters, and then sucking all that air and spitting everything back up because they're just so full. And it looks like milk that went in just came right out. So you see these kind of digestive issues, sleep issues, they're really common with these babies who have the neurological version of torticollis. And it's not like a muscle thing. You can stretch and exercise that muscle till the cows come home, but unless you change the tone of the brain, then it's really not going to shift. And there is a really predictable way to change that tone. One of the ways that we do that, we look at a test, two of them actually. One's called the pull to sit reflex, and the other one's called the pupillary light reflex. When you shine a light into a baby's pupil, what you should see is that pupil should shrink down and then open back up. Now, some babies don't have their frontal lobes just normally switched on until a little bit later. So it's not the most reliable indicator because it's really common for us to switch on the right frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex first, and then the left one. And so some babies may not have a really good left pupil that's responding to light. So then we've got our backup check. Our backup check's the pull to sit reflex. I've shown you this on prior One Belly Wednesdays, where you hold onto a baby's hands and you pull them up and you look to see if their head is in line with their torso. That's the good version, or if it's drifting off to one side or to the other. So if I have that and that light reflex and some startle responses, and I'm listening to the history of, oh, she's such a good sleepy baby. Well, your brain having damage to it will make you real sleepy. That's why they say be careful with kids who have concussions, right? Don't let them fall asleep. It's effectively what you've been looking at is this little angel has actually had the head trauma, and I would be sleeping that off too. So we're listening for all these things in the history to help me understand, hey, is this something that, yeah, that PT is an absolutely golden referral for you? Or is it something that I need to do cranial work to get the fluid to circulate around and clear that thing out, to get the top couple vertebrae moving really well, to let that fluid flow around from the brainstem and up and around the head to help clear that thing out, the neurological system firing back up? What kind of things do we need to do in order to be able to resolve this? Is it something that'll go away on its own? Not usually. What usually ends up happening is one of two things. One is every single time your child has a growth spurt, you'll see that come back. I've seen it time and time again. That babies that we've been working with for a while, I actually have an OT friend of mine named Rochelle who notices it with her son Drew, that every time he goes through a growth spurt, his head tips off to a little side, and she says, yeah, it's time for another booster adjustment. Let's bring you in. The other time that you'll see that is also with those children who wear the helmets, that plagiocephaly. So what happens is that baby never got caught, never got screened. And so that baby has been laying on his side, like, side of the corner of the head like this. We got a flat spot. It's sometimes straight up, but I'm seeing that less and less with torticollis. You usually see it off to the angle. And so the pediatric orthopedist will look and take an x-ray and say, oh, well, yeah, that's out of our normal range. So we better mold the kid's head to the circle shape. I will tell you, I'm not anti-helmet. I'm just not helmet first. What I usually like to do is work with those providers. We've got Johns Hopkins down the road from us, and they're excellent, excellent providers there. We have seen the best work when we work in tandem, so that I use my hands to free up the sutures, and then they use their devices in order to help hold it. When we're working in tandem together, we usually see really good results, but it's always my preference to be able to see those kids early. So if you are looking at a baby who has a hard time twisting or turning their head, if you're having a hard time with nursing more on one side than the other, if you're having a hard time with that baby being able to settle down when you straighten out the head, it keeps on coming off to the side, chances are your baby has torticollis and you got some options for care. If you or somebody that you know has a baby just like this, had kind of a tricky birth, and we need to get that checked out, then feel free to drop me some comments here. We read through these broadcasting to you on Instagram TV, Facebook Live, and also YouTube. So I look forward to talking with you guys on our next One Belly Wednesday. Until then, I'll